All right, welcome to Culture Couch Live. Hello, Macca, Mel, and Murph. How are we all?
Rudy,
Good, Rizzy. Thank you.
Macca,
Hello,
Mel, Muzi.
Mel.
Actually, geez, on the back of a great weekend of finals, wasn't it? I didn't get to see a lot because of the time difference, but some cracking games, and I think this week's going to be great as well. As we normally do, we have a bit of banter before we get on the Culture Couch Live, and Murph, we were discussing a few things, but you brought up a really good point about probably potentially having a greater awareness around what the company you're joining is. You know, what are their values? Do you want to extrapolate on that? Because we all thought it was a really good, interesting topic for the listeners to hear and for us to really extrapolate over the next sort of 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah, we were just chatting about the success of Geelong and Sydney over the last, how many years was it? What was your stats?
2002, Geelong had been in 14 prelims and Sydney had been in 9 or 10 or something.
Yeah, so we were just talking about the success of them, and if you had a choice to go to an organisation or a club, a company or a club, doesn't matter what, which would you take, and why would you choose that? And my view is that I don't think we spend so much time at work. We spend more time at work than we do with our families. And my view is we don't think carefully enough about where we're going to work. So we go through the job interview process and we're sort of hopeful that we're going to get the job, and then we're really happy when we get the job. But have we really thought about what does it really mean for me? Who are the people? What happens when things don't work? What happens if I make a mistake at work? So really putting the emphasis back on me exploring who my potential employer is, as opposed to me just being happy to get a job.
And it's a bit, Macca, about aligning your values, isn't it? Because, I mean, we've all been in a position, particularly at your first job, I guess, when you come out of the uni or whatever, where your priorities are just, I want to make some money. But there's merit to what Murph's saying, isn't it? Because we do spend a lot of time at work. And if we end up at an organisation where, my values are honest, supportive and passionate, and everyone's dishonest, not supportive, and couldn't give a rat's backside about the job, it becomes really difficult, doesn't it? So how much of it, and we're probably talking about something that's really difficult to do, but how much of that is probably deciding your own personal values and trying to align them with whoever you're going to work for, whether it be a footy club or whoever it is?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've got to think back a long time here. When I was at uni, it is a very long time ago, but in those days there were eight big accounting firms, and they were all lined up. I was at Melbourne Uni, and you get your application forms, you fill them all out. I got lucky, got 8 interviews, but I didn't really understand how to work that all through until I started to talk to other people about what they were looking out for in the firms. And as the interviews got underway, you then start another filter system becomes available to you. The people that are standing before you, the process that they want to talk about in terms of induction, the structured learning you're going to get applied to do leading into the professional year. So I went in blind. I didn't really have a value system. I had to sort of learn that pretty quickly, and then chose to go to one of them, and made a pretty good choice. Yeah, it was challenging, but that process of having a decision-making filter or mechanism, be it your values, the role models you might be looking out for, the learning that you want to go on and develop. I think a lot of people need to sort of really commit to that process before they start interviewing.
What about, Mel? How hard is it to interview the interviewer, to Murph's point? Like, how hard is it to sort of sit there and sort of say, yeah, look, thanks very much, but can you just let me know, what are your values? What do you stand for? What's going to happen if this happens? How difficult is that to be part of the process? Because I guess that's what we're really saying, isn't it? We're really saying interview the interviewer.
Absolutely. It's a two-way conversation when you're entering a firm. Yes, you need to be the right candidate for them, but they need to be the right employer for you as well. And in terms of the difficulty, I think the interviewee often thinks that it's harder than it is, but I can tell you, as somebody who's conducted countless interviews, I would be delighted to be asked those questions. And the preparation, I would urge anybody looking for an organisation to prepare that facet of their interview more so than they know their skills, they know their credentials, they know where they've worked. That's great. You're there because they know that too. But what you need to know, the missing piece, is what are they about? What systems do they have to support you in your journey? And to Murph's point, what happens when something goes wrong? Can you give me some examples? I think they're excellent questions. And to your point, Ruzi, I think people think it's harder, particularly new graduates, James, you mentioned, out of uni, feel like it's harder than it should be. But I can tell you hand on heart, the interviewer would be delighted to hear those questions. So go for it.
Two of my, so I just cruise through life, you know. I went to the first couple of jobs were just cruising through life, and ended up at Melbourne Football Club, and then left there. But my two of my companies where my values didn't align with the company were, you know, later on. And I had to go in and say, I can't do this anymore because your values don't align with my values, and this isn't going to work. So, but it's a really difficult conversation to have, and there's a lot of sort of emotional grief and angst that goes on that pathway through. But probably what I would say is, if you're in a job where your values don't match the values of the company, don't stay. And that's Ruzi and I have worked in workshops where we've actually had these conversations with people, and it's a bit like, oh, really? What are you saying?
It's also a bit running though, Murph, isn't it? Because if I look back at when I first started working at AMP, sometimes it challenges your values because there's part of the workplace that you actually enjoy. And I'll give you an example. So I work at the AMP. I'm down at Fitzroy. I actually didn't like the work, but I had flexi time. I had a paycheck. I had a gym. I had a gym in the building. I had a cafe in the building. So there's parts of so there's the challenging part, isn't it? Because not everything's gonna to fit you, Macca, is it? So not every part of the job. So it can be quite challenging to your own values. And as we're discussing it now, I've never really thought about it before, but I was able to compartmentalize it and go, I actually don't like the work, but this is fantastic because I can get to training early. So there was a means to an end around what I was doing. Now, as I look back, was I letting my teammates down? No, I think I was doing the job adequately, and I think I was never shirking the issue and shirking the task. So talk to that.
Yeah, hang on, before you go to Macca, I'm going to challenge you on this. I'm going to challenge you big time because you're going through the motions there, mate. You're not one of those blokes that his teammates are looking around going, hey, Ruzi's in this with us. He loves this company. He's going to drive really hard. They're looking at you.
Great point, because I wonder what they would say, because I'm sitting there going, and I'm saying to you now, I think I was doing the right thing, but no one challenged me back then, or no one sort of questioned me. So I don't know as I stand here now. But you're right, Murph. There might have been half the staff going, geez, have a look at Ruzi. He's always knocking off at 3:30. He's always taking his flexi day. Yeah, all sorts of things. Yeah. But for me, and again, that's where that challenge of your own values, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. I was still young, and I love my footy, so I didn't really care. But
I didn't really care. That's the bit.
But again, I suppose what I'm asking, Macca, when you look back, is there a time where your own value system was challenged through,
well, I think
work or
challenged? It was actually shaped. I think, I think if I'm honest, you're 21 or whatever. I think I just turned 21 going into that job. You're constantly being assessed. Every piece of work you did was being reviewed, and you were getting feedback. And that was a bit new, other than being graded at university. This was how you were doing it, what all sorts of feedback was given. And then there was an entry into more structured learning, and you were going to be assessed externally by the institute on your abilities. But look, it all actually helped form my values, I think. I remember being asked, actually, what are your values when I was about year 3 into my career? And I was, I didn't have a clue. they actually became known
Yeah.
to me, and they now form the trustee of my family trust. It is an acronym, but we won't go into that. But yeah, I didn't have a system, and I had to develop it. And it was sort of partly through the interaction of being reviewed and feedback and enjoying parts of the work. And to your point, there were parts of accounting that I wanted to move away from, and I moved from auditing into tax as a result. But it was a gradual process of forming those values.
And question with that notice maker, you haven't thought to change your values in 120 years?
I have thought to change them. Luckily, there were 5, Murph, so I focus on different ones.
I was part of a workshop yesterday, Ruzi. This is on topic, by the way, where the leader got up and he reeled off his values at the beginning. Resilience, compassion, hard work, and empathy. And it was fantastic. It was fantastic to hear because I then requested that someone from the team stand up and report in on the CEO's values. Was he living them?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
There was a bit of a murmur went around the room, but they did it, and it was fantastic. It was really good. It was really good. Number one, that the leader knew his values, was prepared to share them with the team, and then number 3, he was validated by the team member. So I think it's really important that we understand who we are, what we stand for, and does our organisation match it. And I think the early days of your job are easy because you just go in it, but it's more difficult, as you say, when you get to mid career. Like, you're getting paid a fair bit of money, and it's like, man, if I leave this job, I've got to take I'm taking a risk here. I've got a mortgage, a family. So it's a fascinating concept, I think.
I was going to say, Mel, on that, because what Macca touched on and what Murph just touched on then is when you're young, you don't know. That's how important culture is. Because if you get with a bad culture, sometimes you're going to get swept up in it, aren't you? And you don't know. You don't know what you don't know. So Macca said, look, I get to my first job. I've got pretty good role models. I don't really know what values look like. So they shape me, which is probably what happens everywhere. So that's how important culture is, isn't it? And systems and generations. Yeah. Because if you get with a really good culture as a 20, 21, 22-year-old, as I did at Fitzroy when I went down at 17, you're on your path. If you don't, then all of a sudden your values are misaligned in a sense, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so it's exactly what you said at the beginning of that, Ruzi. You don't know a bad culture until you have experienced a good one sometimes when you're very young.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, my advice is to talk to people who do have that experience. Use your resources, use the people around you, and you will start to navigate and start to build what your own values and your own needs from an organisation are. And the other thing I will say, just to touch on Jez's point earlier, when the question about the values of the business comes to the fore in an interview, often what might happen is they might read them off the wall behind them. Yeah. So be very conscious of that. So what Jez's example just made me illuminated to me was that the CEO is actually living the principles that he believes in. And that's a huge part of it. So yes, in an interview, ask the question, but make sure through the questioning that they're actually bringing them to life and they're actually exuding them in their behaviours every day. And that's a wonderful example from Jez's client yesterday, but it's not always the case. This is my point here.
I was going to say, Ruzi, one of the things, just picking up your point about going into a culture that isn't so good, one of the things I think is really important, that is, if you are a young person coming into a company and you've come from a hardworking, fair, respectful background, family, school, etc., and you go into a company that doesn't fit that, be really careful about staying, because you will start to normalize 100%. Behavior. So it's that whole conversation about, do people change in a system? They do if they're there long enough. And it's really important that you don't start to normalize inappropriate or unacceptable behavior, because if you do,
the other thing that's going to happen, Murph, it's going to affect your other relationships, isn't it? Because suddenly that person in that family environment is X, Y, Z, as you and suddenly they change, and then the family's not going to change because they're indoctrinated into. So all of a sudden you've got this bashing of heads. So it's a really, really good point.
Yeah, and you're conflicted internally because you're accepting stuff you know is not right, and so it just becomes this angry ring or vicious circle, as they say. I think it goes a bit just I know you're about to finish up, Reezy, but I'm always fascinated by number 1 draft pick or number 2 draft pick, and they nominate where they want to go, and everyone jumps on them and says, that's how dare they? Who do they think they are? But based on this conversation today, if I was a number 1 or 2 or 3 draft pick, I think I'd actually be nominating the club that I wanted to go to. Yeah,
well, I mean, that's where the system is always up for challenge, the AFL system and the draft system, isn't it? It's never really been challenged.
Yeah.
But I've spoken about this a lot in the National Football League, those who follow the National Football League. Normally, the number 1 pick is a quarterback, goes to the worst team. And I've spoken to my son about this a lot. If I'm the 5th best quarterback, that's the best position to be in, because suddenly I'm going to the 16th best team, not the 32nd best team.
Yeah.
That's a much better scenario than actually go. And Trevor Lawrence, again, without getting into too much detail, was by far the best player in college football, went to the worst team and really struggled, which to that point. So Mel, just I want to touch on before I finish, I think you made a really good point about the interview process. I think one way to do that, did they turn up on time? Did they, and we talk about at the start of our workshop. So, how was the person interviewing me dressed? Did they come in? What were their mannerisms during the process of me getting interviewed? Did they send the emails back on time? Did they ring me back on time? Because that's your culture, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's fine what's on the wall, but the actions in and around the interview process, I think, will give you a really good idea of the culture of the organisation. Listen, great conversation. So well done. I really enjoyed that. Great conversation. Thanks, Macca. Thanks, Mel.
No worries, Rizzy. Thank you.
Another big weekend of footy. D's versus the Lions, and Freo versus the Pies. Pies were a bit stiff on the weekend. A couple of cracking games, as you'd expect this time of year.
Pies weren't stiff, mate. I just don't think they're good enough.
Gee whiz, there's a lot of. Let's scratch that out of it when we thought that was. And you get rid of that comment, please.
We'll see what sort of response we get from that.
Hang on, I did read an article talking about culture. I think it was Pendles or someone said that Collingwood's no longer the most hated team. Everyone loves Collingwood now. It's their second team. Is that right? Is that what's happened in Melbourne since I left?
I can't believe that for 1 second, Paul. I cannot believe that for 1 second.
All right, well, have a great weekend and good luck to all those 4 teams that are still in the AFL final. So thanks very much for joining us on the Culture Couch Live, and we'll see you next week.